Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the last of 3 virtual sessions in preparation for the upcoming training for TPP grantees. My name is Megan Downey, Project Director at Youth Catalytics, and joining me is Beth Cantor of Spitfire Strategies, as well as Heather Sullivan, who is serving as the organizer of the Go-To training session today. This session will focus on crafting the right message, and the recording will be shared with grantees who could not attend. We also ask that you share this recording with the 1 or 2 representatives from your TPP program who will join us at the training. The training, entitled Messages That Matter, Storytelling and Communicating for Impact, will be held at the DoubleTree by Hilton Hotel Bethesda in Bethesda, Maryland, and will begin on the morning of March 29th and end midday on March 30th. Please note that today, March 7th, is the last day to book your hotel room at the discounted rate. So if you've not already done so, please book your room today. After today, reservations will be accepted on a space available basis and maybe at a significantly higher rate. This virtual prep session was made possible by a grant from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Office of Adolescent Health. However, the views expressed in the session do not reflect the official policies of the Office of Adolescent Health or the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Just a few virtual housekeeping notes. Chrome is the preferred browser for all future online trainings, as Chrome allows for all of the functionality that we'd like to use in future sessions. Also, feel free to use the chat box feature if you have a question or a comment for the presenters. We will be hosting breakout sessions at the end of the training via conference call, which will not be recorded. And these breakouts will give you the opportunity to ask trainers questions in small groups. Also, there will be a brief set of evaluation questions that will pop up on your screen at the end of the training. Your answers are very important to us, so please keep your browser open at the end of the training and take the 2 to 3 minutes it will take to complete the evaluation after the breakout session. Youth Catalytics is pleased to serve as one of 5 partner organizations in the LEAD Collaborative, which aims to provide OAH TPP grantees with capacity building assistance in 5 priority areas. Delivering capacity building assistance in the communications and dissemination priority area, we at Youth Catalytics, we're a nonprofit training and research organization that's been working with youth-serving organizations for the past 35 years. We're very pleased to be working on this project with Spitfire Strategies, a leading communications firm that has partnered with some of the nation's most influential foundations and nonprofits to help them to communicate effectively. You will have the opportunity to meet all of us in person at the training, and I encourage you to contact me directly for more support or assistance in the days leading up to and after the training. My contact information will be shared at the end of this session, but now I'd like to introduce today's lead trainer, Beth Cantor. Beth Cantor is an Executive Vice President at Spitfire Strategies. Prior to joining Spitfire, Beth was the Senior Vice President of External Affairs for Planned Parenthood of Illinois. As a vice president at the Chicago-based public affairs firm Tusculca Terman & Associates, Beth won the prestigious Silver Trumpet Award from the Publicity Club of Chicago for her work with the AFL-CIO on the Democratic Presidential Forum. In 2007, Beth led the historic political program for the Chicago Federation of Labor that elected 6 new aldermen to the Chicago City Council and passed the Big Box Living Wage Ordinance. With that, I will hand it over to you, Beth.
Thank you so much, Megan, and I am so thrilled to be with you all this afternoon. I've had the chance to get to know many of you during the breakout sessions and looking forward to talking to you all about messaging today. We're going to cover some of the basics today so that when we are in person in DC later this month, we can do the 201 version of messaging. But the main 3 things that we are going to cover today. First, we're going to be talking about how to identify your audience so you know who you need to reach. Second, we're going to talk about how to develop effective messaging by tapping into values. And we'll really paint a picture of the world if this action is done correctly. And then finally, we're going to review some of the sins of messaging, traps that nonprofits can sometimes fall into, and how you can avoid them. And then, as Megan mentioned, we're going to go into some breakout sessions so we can talk through messaging and get ready for the session in Washington. As Megan mentioned, not only can you use the chat box, I hope you do, because I would love to hear from you during this webinar. And so with that, question that I would love to hear in the chat box are the audience and messaging challenges that you faced related to your teen pregnancy prevention work. So go ahead and type in some of the challenges that you may have had as you are working to communicate about your teen pregnancy prevention program. So as people are typing in some of their challenges, one of the things that I heard on the last session that we did on storytelling is that some folks have had some messaging challenges about how to talk about teen pregnancy prevention when you're trying to get something not to happen. So it's kind of the inverse of what we're typically trying to do, you know, particularly without framing it in a way that when it does happen, it's not shaming teen parents. So that's, I know, something that is a little bit challenging. So some of the challenges that some folks are having, that they're not direct service providers, that they work in conservative communities, LGBT issues, working, again, yes, in the Bible Belt and those conservative communities seems to be a recurring theme here. Let's see, working to connect silos, that is always a challenge that folks have. What are some of the other things? Inclusive sexual health education for the LGBT community. This is a good one. Some people say that the problem is solved because the rates are going down. And Tanya here says, getting the message across that our programs prepare teens for the future, not our programs that encourage sex. Yeah, and some state representatives don't really have a stance on teen pregnancy prevention. Others are talking about authenticity with the youth voice. So sounds like there are lots of challenges here, and we like to say at Spitfire that a challenge is just an opportunity waiting to happen. So we will get a chance to talk through some of those challenges both today, primarily in the breakout sessions, and again when we are in person later this month. So keep those top of mind, and we will help you figure out how you can get through those messaging challenges. But first, one of the most important things that we need to do is to identify the audiences who we need to communicate with. The decision maker is ultimately the person who is going to say yes or no to what it is that you're trying to achieve. And your audiences, on the other hand, are the folks who you need to communicate with to actually reach that decision maker. I mean, the first question that you should really ask yourself is, can you reach the decision maker directly? Can you meet with this person? Do you have a relationship so that they're likely to listen and respond to what you have to say? If the answer to that is yes, you score the bullseye here, because that means that your audience and decision maker are the same person. A lot of times we aren't so lucky. And so if you don't have access to and a relationship with your decision maker, you'll need to reach out to the other audiences that the decision makers listen to. And that's where some of these concentric circles in the target here come into play. You want to find audiences who do have access to and a close relationship with that decision maker. You also want to think about who is actually going to listen to you and your organization, and who cares about the issue that you're dealing with, who cares about teen pregnancy prevention. And obviously, the closer in you can get to the decision maker, the better it is for identifying those audiences. So when we start talking about analyzing and targeting our audience, I want to start with a question here. So again, use that chat box to tell the group 3 things about yourself. So to give you an example, I have 2 sons. They are not twins, but they share the same birthday. I am a die-hard Duke basketball fan, and if you ask anyone in Spitfire's DC office, they will tell you that I am absolutely terrified of mice. So take a second and type in 3 things about yourself. All right, Cindy loves kayaking. She has 2 huskies, and she's going to Yellowstone for the 3rd time this summer. Joanne has 4-year-old twins. Good luck to you, Joanne. Let's see. Oh, these are coming in fast and furious. All right. Archana has 2 sons, 7 years apart. She likes to sing, and she has a cat. Esmeralda, I have 2 daughters, 20 years old and 13. Monique has a dog, loves football and reading. Kathy loves boating and has a boat in Florida. Let's see. Sonia is passionate about improving the world. She loves pizza and creating homemade ice cream. Joanne loves to cook and is going to Paris for the first time. So I could read each of these responses, and I could ask every single person in your office, every single person in my office, folks walking down the block right now, right outside my window, and nobody, not a single person would say that they are a member of the general public. Everyone said something different, but you'll notice that no one described themselves by saying, I am the general public. We have a joke in this office. If anyone says that they are messaging to the general public, there's like a jar that you've got to put $10 into. So we try to keep no money in that jar, but our clients often say, I want to talk to the general public. But when you are evaluating audiences, there is no general public. If you are talking to everyone, although Maisha is telling me that she is a member of the general public, but if you are talking to everyone, you are in fact talking to no one. Your messaging will be too broad, too diverse, and will not resonate with the folks who in fact you need to reach. So when you are thinking about audience segmentation, you really want to think small. Segment until you can't segment anymore. Get as narrow and targeted as possible. Find the descriptors for the audience that are as specific as you can possibly make them. You know, for example, don't say you need to reach women. That's code for half of the general public. We're not getting anyone there. Instead, think about which age group you need to reach, where they live, what their lives are like. Maybe you really need to reach women age 40 to 60 who live in the suburbs, or young women and women of reproductive age who use long-acting reversible contraceptives. Think about how descriptive you can actually be in who you are trying to reach. So let me give you an example of how to segment your audience in action. So in Salinas, California, the local health department created a behavior change campaign. They wanted to increase the number of Latinos who were at a healthy weight by 10%. So the health department had access to local residents, but truth be told, and they recognize this, that they weren't influential with them. So the first question that they asked themselves is, who would be influential with these local residents? That's when they realized that the owners of local taquerias were their priority audience. These owners could add healthy options to their menu. They could promote healthy choices with their patrons. The other critical audience here that also was well respected in the community was the local police chief. So he was another person who could talk about lifestyle changes. This campaign really narrowed their audiences. So the police chief, that's one person, and the taqueria owners, that's a pretty small group. So the lesson here is that to define your audience as narrowly as possible so that you are more likely to be successful. This is another example from Goodwill. You know, Goodwill, as you all probably know, they sell donated goods to raise money for charity. So let's say hypothetically that they want to increase the amount they donate to charity this year, which in turn means that they have to actually increase their sales. So their objective, their SMART objective, strategic, measurable, actionable, rational, and time-bound, is to increase donations by 25% this year. So who do they need to reach to achieve this objective. Which audience should Goodwill target for this objective? So again, please use the chat box to share your ideas about who the audience might be. Past donors, that's a great idea. Other folks, so again, they need to increase the number of people who are going to visit their stores so that they can increase their sales. People who are moving, millennials, those who move in the area, people within short, convenient driving distances, college students, people who want tax write-offs. These are all great ideas. They decided because they want to narrow in on people who are going to actually shop at the Goodwills, so they were focusing on people who shop. Then they thought about this a little bit more, and they said, yeah, I like Sonia's response here. She's right on where my head is going. Young women who love to get new clothes frequently. That's exactly where they went in their thinking, because they realized that people who shop is not too far off from the general public, right? So they were able to narrow that down. They didn't want to focus, however, on traditional thrift store shoppers. Instead, they focused on young women who are fashion conscious and on a budget, exactly what Sonia was saying here. So their message was that you can find affordable and fashionable clothes at Goodwill. So Goodwill segmented its audience as narrowly as possible, which then in turn made it much easier for them to develop and get their messaging out there. One of the cool things that they did, the Goodwill here in DC launched a fashion blog that connected the nonprofit to a younger audience. They got a CNN story 2 days before Christmas. They also teamed up with a local sorority or a sorority at the University of Tennessee to put on a fashion show. So I think a couple of the lessons that we can take from this is that Goodwill did a fantastic job narrowing its audience, which enabled them to develop really targeted messaging, and then that made them have a much easier time coming up with the communication activities and tactics that would reach its audience because they were really specific about it. So next we're going to cover what you need to know about your audience. Once you've identified your audiences, you need to have a strong understanding of what we call their stage of readiness. So in other words, what I mean by that is where they stand on your issue. So there's 3 options here. The first is sharing knowledge. The second is building will. And the third is reinforcing action. So we're going to talk about how to know which stage you're in and how to move your audience from one stage to the next. So if you're in the sharing knowledge stage, your audience really doesn't know, care, and believe what you're telling them and what you're asking them to do, and what you're asking them to do matter. Like knowing and caring are 2 different things. Your audience needs to know and care if they're going to advance from this stage. So an example here, for a long time, people really didn't understand the harmful effects of secondhand smoke. And public health organizations needed to educate folks about how dangerous secondhand smoke was. So here is another example of an ad that reinforces the idea that AIDS is an epidemic and it still kills people. It's designed to counteract the perception that patients can take drugs and live forever. So again, this is knowledge sharing. Another good example, we all know that recycling is important, but do we all do it 100% of the time? I like to think I do, but I would not be telling the truth. No, this is really an issue of caring, not so much knowing, but again, caring. So sometimes an audience will be in sharing knowledge because they have the information, but they don't actually believe the person telling them. So that is a really strong indication that you need to consider who your messenger is, and you might want to switch that up. So again, when your audience is in the sharing knowledge stage, your communication activities really do in fact need to share some knowledge. And that doesn't have to be everything you know, just enough to motivate them. You want to share information that connects with your audience's values, and we're going to be talking a lot more about that. And you want to use a messenger who is credible with your audience. Does that make sense to folks who are in the sharing knowledge phase? Type yes in the chat box if that you're all good, or type in no if you want me to clarify anything there. Awesome. So it makes lots of sense to folks. So we are now in building will. This is a stage where your audience knows, they care, and they believe what you're saying, and they get the fact that what you're asking them to do matters, but they're still not doing it. So the key here is to identify and address what is standing in their way. What are their barriers? So to do that, you've got two options. The first is that you can stay in their comfort zone. So sometimes all you need to do to address a barrier is to make sure that your initial ask is within their comfort zone. So it may be too big an ask to have your audience speak at your annual gala, but they might be willing to support your sustainability efforts. So think about what you're asking your audience to do and where it falls in their comfort zone. As you build a relationship, you can gradually expand their comfort zone. I like to think of this as you don't ask someone to drive you to the airport after only a first date. So the second option that you have is make the reward bigger than the risk. Here, you're going to go outside of your audience's comfort zone, but you've got to make sure that if you're going to do that, that the reward, what they're going to get out of that, is much bigger than the perceived risk that they have. So again, let me share with you an example. So what's the barrier that Kashi is trying to overcome here? So again, type in that chat box to share your ideas. Yep, that healthy food is nasty, it's tasteless, you know, that it does not taste good. Absolutely. So that is how they are overcoming the barrier here. So they are trying to get over the fact that healthy food doesn't taste good. So that last stage of knowledge is reinforcing action. And this is when you're thanking your audience for having taken a certain action. You want to explain the role that supporters played in getting you there and celebrate victories by giving them a pat on the back. A lot of nonprofits fall into the trap of asking people to do too much. You make a small step forward, but now we need you to give more money, write 3 more letters, stay on 3 email lists. After too many asks, you know, you really start to lose people. So whenever you have the opportunity, you should thank members and supporters to keep them engaged. This is not a communication where you should ask your audience to do something else, like donate money. Save that for something separate. So New York City City Harvest does a great job of that. They have an annual fundraiser where they ask people to skip lunch on one day and give the money they would normally spend to a nonprofit. And this ad that they took out in the New York Times, it's simply a thank you. That thank you makes audiences feel really good about their support. It also makes them feel like you're making progress and that the problem is not intractable. So it's really important to know what your audience cares about. Not everyone shares the same values. So you need to know what your audience cares about to create a message that will get them to listen to you. This is where I was talking about values before. Sometimes the fact of the matter is you won't know what your audience cares about, and ideally this is where research comes in, whether it's a public opinion poll or focus groups or other ways of investigating what's important to your audiences. Keep in mind that sometimes your audience's core concerns won't be obvious, and you'll have to do some work to figure them out. That's what we're going to talk a little bit more about now. So when developing existing messages, you need to tap into your audience's existing values, not your own. You know, so it's not what I care about, it's what they care about. I know this can be hard because you know so much about teen pregnancy prevention, and you know very clearly why people should care about this. But the trap that folks fall into is that you think that you can move people based on what you think or what the organization cares about, not what actually motivates the people who you're trying to convince. And it's more difficult than just change the values. Change is really slow. You know, when's the last time you actually changed your values? So if you want to make progress sooner, tap into your audience's existing values. You know, whether it's, you know, we saw this a lot in the case of some social shifts that we saw around civil rights or same-sex marriage. You know, so also be aware of how those conversations are happening. Because the fact of the matter is, audiences have their own values, their own core concerns, and to shift those values, it can sometimes take 15, 20 years. Has anyone changed their values anytime recently because someone asked you to? I'm going to think that because there's, yep, no, not recently, nope, nope, nope. I can't even imagine the last time I've actually changed my values because someone asked me to, and knowing my personality, I would do the exact opposite. So to actually speed things along, you really want to tap into what people already care about. An apocryphal story that we like to share is an example of an organization that was trying to stop expansion of additional runways at the San Francisco airport. And for those folks who have flown in there or who know it, the runway sticks right into the bay. And there was this environmental group that cared deeply about stopping this expansion because of the detrimental impact it was going to have on a species of endangered frogs. So they came to us and they said, help us. We've got to stop this project. You know, the frogs, they are going to be wiped out and we cannot have this happen. So we went and commissioned research and found out great, awesome, fantastic news. The public doesn't want this airport expansion either. They said, fantastic, so glad to hear that. And we said back to them, well, here's the thing though, and here's what you need to message about, because why they don't want the expansion. For these folks, it's all about the traffic. This airport expansion is going to create so much more traffic. And so we said to them, connecting the expansion with traffic in a campaign about this, we got this. We can stop this, absolutely. This environmental group took about 10 seconds, and they paused, and they thought about it, and they said, yeah, no, not so much. We're doing this for the frogs. So all of that is to say, clearly, they wanted to do it for the frogs, and frogs, in fact, were not going to stop that airport expansion. You know, we always want to do it for the frog. That's why, you know, we do what we do here at Spitfire. We believe in social change. But to achieve our objectives, we often, quite frankly, have to talk about the traffic. And in fact, the values don't have to be big concepts like justice or world peace. Sometimes they have to be closer to home, like saving time and money. I heard the other day a great thing that they were, an organization that I'm now working with, they were able to tap into an organization's values that what they were proposing was going to reduce paperwork. And sometimes, quite frankly, it's just about having a tasty lunch. Think about emotional and rational values. Think between the lines. This is an example from the Chesapeake Bay Club. They wanted people to stop fertilizing lawns to protect the bay. And if anyone here is from Maryland like I am, we love our crab cakes. And the fact of the matter is that excessive fertilizer was going into the water and killing the crabs. And this is a problem for people from, you know, Maryland, DC, who love their crab cakes like me. So this ad here plays into this existing value, and instead of trying to get people to care about the pollution and its effect on flora and fauna, they smartly led with the crab cakes. You can also message, as we saw in that Kashi ad, based on barriers. So the barrier here, you know, what does anyone have a thought as to what the barrier is that they're trying to overcome in this message? Yeah, high cost of paying for school. That's absolutely right. So when you first suggest that someone should go to college, the first thing that you're going to ask is if they have the money. So they are addressing the barrier right off the bat. We'll talk about this later when we get into our message box, but it's important not to say, we know you think you can't afford it. This is just getting straight past the barrier, not repeating it. So if you do repeat the barrier, it's just going to reinforce it. Just think about President Nixon's "I am not a crook." I dare anyone to think of Nixon without thinking about the fact that he's a crook. So now we are going to spend a little bit of time talking about theme, which is where we get into building truly persuasive messaging. Theme is the last thing that you're thinking about before you dive into the messaging yourself. So it's going to help give you direction as you go into the messaging. So you've selected a value for your audience. Now you will need to connect it to the issue that you're going to talk about. So think about recent Volvo ads. You know, their theme, they are all about safety. You know, you compare that to Mazda, you know, their cutesy Zoom Zoom. What are they selling? They are all about the fun. So two very similar projects, both cars, two very different themes there. So let me show you an example of 3 teen anti-smoking campaigns that all use different themes. So in this first one, their theme is that it's bad for your health. Smoking makes you sick, you'll get cancer. And we know that a lot of teens value rewards much more than risks compared to adults. You know, we've seen that in a lot of different neurological studies. And most teens are trying to rebel. And as a result of telling them that it's bad for your health and it makes you sick, smoking rates didn't really decrease. Because this here assumed that teens actually care about their health. So this campaign didn't pick the right value, because teens don't care about their health. They really think that they are invincible. So this organization, for those of you who might recognize it, the Truth Campaign, they approached this with a different theme. You know, they basically were saying smoke or don't smoke, we don't care. But what you need to know is that if you're doing this, you're actually being manipulated by the man, you know, that old white dude. So they were tapping into the value of wanting to rebel against authority and associate smoking with being duped or manipulated by the man. So this messaging was effective and smoking rates dropped, but there was still one really resistant audience, teenage girls ages 13 to 15. So how do we get to them? The focus here was on vanity or beauty. Cigarettes, as Christy Turlington shows us here, they will make you ugly. This was really effective, but it's very different than you know, manipulation or anything like that. And I think that the thing to note here is that some approaches are better than others, and some are equally effective. The key is you have to pick one at a time to focus on. So any questions before we dive into writing persuasive messaging? Yeah, Estelle is totally right. Smoking causes wrinkles. Absolutely, that will get at least folks in their late 20s to think about smoking. I don't know if teenage girls actually care about that. So any questions before I move on here? Feel free to type them in the chat box. All right, if you don't have any now, feel free to type in any questions as we go along. But now we are going to actually talk about developing the right messages for your target audiences. For this, Spitfire uses what we call the message box. There are 4 key pieces to the message box, as you can see here. And does anyone know why we have 4 components of the message box? All right, well, we do that, quite frankly, because people can only remember 4 things at a time. So let me actually stop here before I dive deep into the message box to ask us, answer a question that Sonia posed that I think is a good one. So how do you recommend finding out what people care about? So again, if you've got money and resources to be able to conduct, whether it's qualitative research or quantitative research, that's fantastic. A lot of time nonprofits, organizations don't have those kind of resources and aren't able to do that, but there is a lot of publicly available data that can help you figure that out, whether you're looking at work that other allied organizations may have done in the past. A lot of them are going to be willing to share that with you because you guys are all in this together. You can also look at resources like Gallup and other polling companies that publicize their findings online. You can obviously talk to folks in your community. You don't have to have, focus groups where you're behind, the two-way glass. You can just talk to the people who you need to reach to get a sense. A lot of times when we develop messaging for our clients, we'll tell our clients to go out and road test it, see how it resonates. Are people really understanding what it is that you're saying? Does it seem like you're tapping into their values? So, sometimes just getting feedback from folks you're going to be talking to and asking those questions, it doesn't have to be a formal research process as well. So again, this is, and thank you for that question, Sonia. I thought it was a great one. So as folks come up with questions, either feel free to type them in or save them for the breakout session that we are going to have afterwards. So again, here are the 4 key components of the message platform. The first piece of the message box is the value message. This is what we've been talking about. This is the message that's going to get your audience nodding their heads. It must, again, have their values, not yours. You can have supporting points, but the message box is the foundation for every communication. So you're talking about from Facebook posts to hour-long speeches and everything in between. But for each of these, they should not be more than a sentence. Again, you can bring in supporting points or a story or an anecdote where you need it, but again, this is your top line tailored messaging for those audiences, so that you start with the value message, making sure that you understand where your audience is coming from. Moving to the right is what we had been talking about, the barrier message. So when you say something that people agree with, that you've tapped into their value, then they'll pause for a second and their minds will start racing and they'll say to themselves, yeah, but, so this is the message that's going to help them get around their best excuse for not doing what it is that you want them to do. So immediately address their hesitation. And again, don't ever repeat the barrier, because repeating the barrier reinforces it. Again, Nixon, not a crook. That's the thing that I always keep in mind, so that I remember not to repeat the barrier, but to instead overcome it. The next part of the message box is the ask. What is it that you want them to do? This should be clear and attainable, so you can be sure that people know exactly what you want them to do. So asking for support, that's not a great ask. You want to make sure it's measurable or concrete. And again, it's only one thing. And it should be commensurate, again, with where they are in their stage of knowledge. So again, my example of don't ask someone to drive you to the airport after a first date. And that final piece of the message box is the vision. That's going to give folks a sense of what they get if you do what they ask. So what does success look like? It answers that so what question. And the important thing here is that the vision reflects the values that you identified. So the cool thing that I love about the message box is really you can pick and choose any one of those 4 components. You don't have to go in the same area and in the same direction where you start with the value. So when you're using these within your communication materials, they can be used in a variety of different orders. You can talk about the vision and the ask, but you don't necessarily have to include the barrier and in different compilations together. So let me share with you an example from an organization that I've been working with over the past year or so. Upwardly Global, I don't know if folks are familiar with this organization, but they connect immigrants and refugees who want to rebuild their careers with employers who are looking for experienced global talent. The analogy that I always use when describing them, it's a lot of times if you're ever in a taxi or an Uber or a Lyft and you get to talking with the driver and you find out that they were a doctor or a lawyer or a teacher or scientist in their home country. So it's getting those types of folks who are work or authorized in the United States, getting them placed in job services. So their objective that they identified is that by the end of 2017, by the end of this year, they wanted to secure 8 new employer partners. So they were going to target, one of their target audiences was corporate social responsibility executives at large American companies that had inclusion programs. So fairly narrow targeting there. So here is the message box that we developed for them. You know, the value that corporate social responsibility is that they want to be seen as business leaders who are making an impact. So we know that you're committed to establishing an inclusive workplace. You know, the barrier here, and you know, after that value message, they are undoubtedly nodding their heads yes, and then they pause and they're like, yeah, but you know, there's lots of worthy causes out there that are competing for their corporate social responsibility efforts, and they don't have the ability to act on all of them. So here's the message to counterbalance that Upwardly Global and companies like yours have worked together to bring diversity programs to life. You know, let them show that there is, that they've got good experience and a great track record. And you could see here how some of the impact that Upwardly Global has had through the years, how those could be supporting bullet points there. So then the ask is to, and again, this is one thing, take your diversity program to the next level by becoming an employee partner with Upwardly Global. And then finally, that vision message that again must tie back to the value and then starts to think about the reward that they will have. By working with us, your company will become a model in workplace inclusion efforts for companies across the U.S. So again, that value had been that they want to be seen as a leader who is having an impact, and that vision message taps back into that. So let me share with you one other example, going back again to our friends at Goodwill that we had talked about earlier. You know, so they again wanted to tap into the audience that we had talked about, those young fashion-conscious women who like to shop that are somewhat thrifty. So the value message here is you want to look good for less money. You know, some people think that you're not going to find good stuff at Goodwill. So that is the barrier that they are trying to overcome here, that they actually have really quality vintage and contemporary fashions. Super simple ask, come shop here. And then tying it back into that value message, you will look great without breaking the bank. So any questions about the message box? Give folks a moment to type in if you've got any questions there. And again, we will have an opportunity to talk through much more of this during our breakouts afterwards. All right, so hoping this makes sense to everyone. So now, before we go on to create your own messages, we are going to help you point out some of the sins that you want to be aware of and how to avoid them. The first is something that we call MEGO. That stands for My Eyes Glaze Over. You know, this is the jargony, acronym, heavy language that no one can understand. You know, we are always tempted to use big words that we totally get, and no one else does. So another example of this is that cute dolphin there, right? I've heard it called charismatic megafauna before. It's anyone actually know what charismatic megafauna is? You know, we just want to say dolphins and whales are big fuzzy creatures. You know, I've heard people talk about wayfinding systems. Those are just signs. You know, it makes it even more complicated as we're trying to communicate with people where English might not be their first language. If we're saying things like wayfinding system instead of signs, because you don't want to overestimate your audience's knowledge. Use simple terms. You can't make clear points when you include too much information. The next sin of messaging is what we call literal sclerosis. It is a tragic and oftentimes debilitating disease that affects so many people in the nonprofit world. It is where you feel like you have to impart everything that you absolutely know. You really want to ask yourself, what is it that your audience needs to know? Don't overwhelm them with information. Just give them enough to act. You know, you think about the Folgers, you know, their classic slogan, the best part of waking up is Folgers in your cup. Super simple. You know, if you asked a nonprofit to write that slogan, you know, they would probably write something like, best part of waking up is putting on your slippers, seeing family, and among other things, drinking Folgers. But beware of the side effects of coffee. Your teeth could get stained. You'll be jittery, raised heart rate, all those things. So again, give your audience the information that they need to know, not everything that is in your head. Here's another example of literal sclerosis. You know, if you read this, evidence indicates that adjusting for a variation in family income, children with health coverage have better outcomes on standard developmental indicators than do children without such coverage, controlling for environmental factors and adjusting for access to primary care providers. Okay, a much simpler and more effective way of saying this would be, kids with health insurance grow up stronger. Keep it simple. Don't overcomplicate things. Another sin that we often face is that we throw out lots of facts and numbers. And a lot of times people are, you know, they're moved by emotion and perception, not by fact, as we are seeing all too often. So you do not want to do a data dump or create some sort of math problem that people are trying to figure out, okay, what does that really mean? You know, the fact of the matter is statistics can have power, but they have to be in small doses. At the same time, if I told you that 12.7 million people are physically abused, raped, or stalked by their partners in 1 year, you know, would that in fact actually have the impact you want it to? It's a big number, but I have no context for that. You know, instead, being able to compare that and being able to tell folks that that's basically the size of New York City and LA combined, that is way more powerful and gives a true sense of the magnitude, right? So the message really brings the statistic to a contextual level that people can relate to. So again, to try and prevent statistical overload, you know, you don't want to have too many charts or graphs, and make sure that you're giving context so that one strong statistic resonates. So, you know, another thing, if you're thinking, and I'm seeing this in the chat box, that people are talking about stories, that is a wonderful way to bring statistics to life, and that's a lot about what we talked about last week with Dennis. So absolutely think about how stories can help bolster what it is that you are trying to share with folks. And you guys must have seen my next slide, because that is exactly the point here. You know, make sure that you are telling stories, because that's, again, how the brain processes information. What you guys are doing with these teen pregnancy prevention programs, it's so incredibly compelling, and it does create so many important stories about the people who you're helping, who you're connecting with, the folks who are doing the work, and the people who are part of these programs. Tell these stories. They are the most powerful form of communication that we have. Feeding America does a tremendous job that exemplifies the power of storytelling, and their Faces of Hunger really shares and tells the stories about people and families who are facing these dire circumstances. So think about, again, hearkening back to everything that we learned from Dennis, making sure that we are incorporating stories in everything that we are doing to help bring our work to life. So the last question that I will pose to you all is, who is the best person to carry the message to your audience? A lot of times I think that we fall into a de facto mode of, well, clearly it should be the president of the organization or the program director. But really ask yourself, are they the best messenger? And if not, who would be better? Sometimes you need to put a campaign on hold until you can recruit effective messengers. So really consider who the best person is to share the information. You know, what's interesting, there was a survey a few years back where the results said that nearly 50% of people trust a person like me the most. Here's another good example here, the Mission Readiness Campaign. This was a campaign for healthier school lunches, and the campaign wanted to get through to decision makers who were really reluctant to get involved in policing school cafeterias because they felt like it was a government overreach. So who do you think that the organization tapped as a credible messenger? They recruited military leaders as messengers and credible spokespeople. They were able to say that improving school lunches, it wasn't just a personal responsibility thing, but this was actually a matter of national security. We need to improve lunches for the future of our armed forces. And almost a third of young people are too fat to fight. So that was incredibly powerful messenger to be able to get kids to realize that they needed to make better decisions with their school lunches. You are leaving this virtual training with a little bit of homework. So we talked about identifying audiences and messages. So think about really narrowing down your audience and their values and aligning messages with those values. Consider the stages of readiness that we talked about and making sure that you are avoiding what we term the sins of messaging. So when you come to DC, think about which are the few most important audiences and their values and an idea of their levelness, and one or two message boxes when you come to DC. So please work on your message box to craft an effective message specifically tailored to your objectives and your audience. And we can fine-tune these and use these to craft messages when we're together at the meeting in March. And the other beautiful thing that I did not point out is the message box is super simple to draw on a piece of paper. It's just 2 big X's. So you can create those on your own. And before we go into our breakout sessions, I do have a question here from Sonia asking about how we find good messengers. I think that it's a question of really thinking about who is going to resonate best with your target audience. Again, a lot of this is available through message research in knowing who people respect and who they look up to and who they value. You can find that, again, through message research. Like, I know I've done a lot of work in the healthcare sphere with the Reaching Latinos and ACA engagement enrollment, and we know that members of their community, people from their local churches, that those are very persuasive messengers for them. And so going, again, to message research will oftentimes help you. And where that is not readily available, I go back to the whole idea you're identifying values. Also talk to people about who they listen to. Whose opinions do they trust? So I think that that is something that you constantly want to be thinking of. And I think that you also want to make sure that you are building in time to reflect on whether or not your messages are hitting with people. And is that because your messenger isn't effective? or is it because the messaging isn't as persuasive? I mean, I would think about if you're communicating with teens and you've got someone who is, much older, and this is, a group that might not actually listen to teens. So think about, is there a peer who would be a more effective messenger? So Sonia wanted some clarification about what I meant by message research. So again, that's where I was talking about the qualitative and the quantitative research that pollsters often do, and that a lot of organizations are able to commission, that can also be found readily available through either Gallup or Pew Research or other organizations that make their research readily available through the web. Real quickly, Shireen asked me to put back up the message box, so I'm going to scroll back very quickly so you guys can see that right here. I will leave that up here for a minute while we then get ready to go into our breakout sessions. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining today's call. And just a reminder, if you need more information or support, to reach out to Megan. And a good reminder that we had is that these slides will be sent out as well for anyone who wants any refreshers on that. And if you are not in my great breakout group, I look forward to meeting lots of you in person when we get together at the end of the month. Thanks so much.